The medieval battlefield has been immortalized in legend, song, and cinema as a place of flashing swords and gallant duels. Yet this is one of history's most enduring illusions. Not every soldier carried a sword, in fact, most did not. And, even for those who did, the sword was not always the deadliest weapon on the field. Some weapons were banned by law or church decree, others concealed until the decisive moment, and a few were so brutal they reshaped the very nature of war itself. So what did soldiers truly carry into battle? The answer often began with the most overlooked of all weapons, the spear. Before a knight's sword was ever drawn, the ground trembled with forests of long sharpened poles. Cheap, effective, and quick to master, spears dominated the battlefields of medieval Europe. A peasant armed with little more than courage and a sharpened pole could, with minimal training, stand against mounted knights. A spear could transform a farmer into a soldier, almost overnight. These were no mere sticks whittled into points. Skilled blacksmiths fitted iron tips that varied in size and shaped broad leaf-shaped blades for slashing and stabbing, or narrow points for piercing mail. Many spears were capped with iron butt, spikes on the lower end. When the blade became lodged in a shield or body, the shaft could be flipped around to deliver crushing blows. This dual-purpose design made the spear not just a thrusting weapon, but a versatile staff of war. Length, too, was a decisive advantage. 6 to 12 feet of reach gave spearmen the power to wound an enemy before he could close the distance. A wall of spear points bristling outward was less an army and more a living machine of death. To charge. Such a formation was to run headlong into a forest of steel. Horses balked at the sight, knights fell from saddles before they ever swung a blade, and infantry lines broke upon those points like waves on rock. But the spear's true strength lay not in the hands of one soldier, but in the discipline of many. Alone, a spearman was vulnerable, his weapon unwieldy at close quarters. Together, in rank upon rank, spearmen became nearly unstoppable. They moved as one body, locking their shields and thrusting in rhythm, creating a meat grinder of iron tips. Entire cavalry charges shattered against them. Victory or defeat often hinged not on individual skill, but on whether the formation held. Yet the sword, gleaming and romanticized, still overshadowed the spear in chronicles and stories. Bards sang of knights clashing blade to blade, not of peasants bracing poles in the mud. The truth was more prosaic, but also more terrifying. Medieval warfare was less about honor duels and more about walls of spears, driving forward with merciless efficiency. Still, in the mud and chaos of war, soldiers understood a simple truth. The spear was the workhorse, the weapon of survival. It was the equalizer between farmer and noble, between the desperate conscript and the armored knight. Before the shining sword was ever drawn, before the banners unfurled and the horns sounded, it was the spear, humble, sharp, and unrelenting, that carved the opening notes of battle. The sword has always been the darling of legend. Chroniclers wrote of it with reverence, poets gave it names, and kings carried blades that seemed to shine with destiny. Yet on the medieval battlefield, the sword was not the common soldier's weapon. It was a luxury, a symbol, and often more about status than survival. A decent sword cost months, sometimes years, of wages. For a peasant levy, that price might as well have been the cost of the moon. Spears and axes were tools of necessity. Swords were the sports cars of the age, expensive, prestigious, and beyond the reach of the ordinary. To wear one at your side marked you as someone of worth, a man with wealth or patronage. The blade was less a weapon and more a badge of identity. Forging a sword was an art as much as a craft. Master smiths guarded their secrets fiercely. Techniques passed from father to son, whispered like sacred incantations. The process demanded precision, iron heated to exact temperatures, hammered, and folded until the steel's grain was strong enough to hold an edge without shattering. A blade could take weeks, even months, to complete. When finished, it was more than metal. It was a thing alive with balance, capable of both elegance and brutality. But swords were not all the same. The arming sword, carried at the hip, was light and one-handed, the knight's daily companion. It was versatile, fit for quick strikes or parries, and a natural partner to a shield. The longsword required both. Hands, heavier but devastating in power, its reach and force capable of breaking through defenses. Then there were the falchion's single-edged, broad-bladed tools of pure aggression, designed not for finesse but for chopping through flesh and bone like firewood. Each style reflected centuries of adaptation, born from the shifting demands of war. And beyond the battlefield, the sword's meaning deepened. Kings swore oaths upon them. Priests blessed them before campaigns. A knight's sword might be buried with him, a final companion into eternity. To wield one was to carry not just steel, but a legacy of authority and honor. Yet, stripped of its mystique, the sword was still a killer's tool, sharp enough to end lives and light enough to wield for hours. For the noble knight, it was indispensable, the symbol of his station and the partner to his shield. For the common soldier, glimpsed only in flashes of steel across the battlefield, it was both an object of awe and a reminder of a world that divided rich from poor, master from servant, iron from wood. So when swords did flash in the heat of combat, they brought with them more than the clang of steel. They carried centuries of craftsmanship, the pride of their owners, and the unmistakable reminder that not all weapons were created equal, not in cost, not in symbolism, and certainly not in the hands that wielded them. If the sword was the prized jewel of the noble, the axe was the brutal reality of the common man. Most axes carried into battle weren't crafted for war at all. They were woodcutters' tools, the same ones used to split logs in the yard or shape timbers for a roof. But in desperate times, any sharp edge became a weapon, and the axe proved terrifyingly effective. Axes required little training. Unlike the spear, which demanded discipline and formation, or the sword, which required years of practice to master, the axe was brutally simple. You swung it, and if it hit, it shattered. Bone shield or helmet it made little difference. One heavy blow could crush through protection that lighter weapons struggled against. To face a man with an axe was to face not grace, but raw force, the kind of violence that rattled even seasoned fighters. Psychology mattered as much as steel. A shield wall might hold against spears, but when the front line saw a bearded warrior charging, axe raised high, it stirred a different kind of fear. There was something primal in that weapon, something that reached back to an older, wilder age. The axe was not refined. It did not parry or feint. It came down with the promise of ruin, and the sight alone was often enough to make men falter. Battle axes, forged specifically for war, took this to another level. Longer hafts gave them reach, balanced heads allowed for quicker swings, and reinforced steel edges cut deeper into armor. A skilled warrior with such a weapon could split shields, shatter bones, and leave a man dead with a single strike. Some even had bearded designs that hooked shields or limbs, dragging opponents off balance before the finishing blow. But few went to war with only one weapon. The wise soldier carried combinations: a spear for reach, an axe for close combat, perhaps even a knife for emergencies. Spears broke, shields splintered, but the axe endured. Its simplicity made it reliable. And in the chaos of battle, when formations collapsed and fighting turned into individual struggles, that reliability could mean survival. Beyond its utility, the axe carried cultural weight. To the Norse, it was more than a tool, it was a badge of identity, a weapon sung about in sagas, wielded by both peasants and kings. In the hands of a Frankish warrior, the throwing axe, or Francisca, became a deadly missile, arcing through the air before battle lines met. Wherever it appeared, The axe left its mark in history not only through wounds, but through memory etched into the minds of those who had seen its edge cleave. Through shield and skull alike. On the medieval battlefield, fear was a weapon in itself. And nothing embodied that better than the axe, a tool of wood and iron that turned ordinary men into symbols of raw, unrelenting violence. Weapons alone never told the full story of survival in medieval battle. What truly separated the living from the dead was not only how hard one could strike, but how well one could endure being struck. Armor was the great equalizer, a constant arms race of protection against destruction. The foundation of nearly every soldier's defense was the gambeson, a padded jacket made of countless layers of linen, wool, or even horsehair, stitched tightly together. It looked humble, but it was the medieval version of a bulletproof vest. Even the poorest foot soldier might afford a basic gambeson, for it could be stitched from scrap cloth, and yet it could turn aside slashes and even blunt the impact of arrows. Worn beneath chain or plate, it became the unseen guardian, soft fabric diffusing the force of steel. Chainmail, or simply mail to those who wore it, was the next level. Imagine 20,000 tiny metal rings, each linked to 4 others, painstakingly riveted shut to form a flexible second skin. To craft one shirt could take months of relentless labor, a puzzle of iron where mistakes were fatal. On the battlefield, mail was a marvel. It turned blades, resisted cuts, and protected against the random chaos of battle. But it was heavy, 20 to 30 pounds draped over the body like carrying a large hound across one's chest. And while it stopped slashes, it did little against crushing blows. Still, for centuries, it was the armor of choice for those who could afford it. Then came the revolution of plate armor. By the late Middle Ages, blacksmiths and master armorers forged not just protection, but artistry in steel. Curved plates, fitted precisely to the knight's body, interlocked in a dance of hinges and joints. To wear a suit of plate was to become something more than human, an ironclad giant, a walking fortress. Myths abound that knights clanked and stumbled like statues, but the truth is more astonishing. A properly fitted suit of plate allowed its wearer to run, jump, even vault into the saddle. Knights trained in armor could fight with agility, their steel suits moving as seamlessly as skin. Helmets carried their own hierarchy. The great helm blocky, enclosing the entire head, was nearly impenetrable, but turned vision into a narrow slit of the world. Later bassinets improved on this, with pointed visors that deflected blows and opened when breath was needed. Each choice was a gamble. Better protection meant less sight, less breath, less freedom. In war, one's helmet decided whether you saw your killer coming or only felt the blow. And yet, armor was more than practical. It was symbolic, announcing one's station in society. A padded jacket declared poverty. Mail signaled a professional soldier. Full plate was the glittering badge of nobility. Armor became a billboard on the battlefield, telling every man where he stood in the brutal hierarchy of war. Still, even the finest armor had weaknesses. Joints, armpits, the gap between visor and breastplate. These were cracks in the fortress, and every soldier knew it. Weapons evolved to exploit them, and warriors trained their strikes toward these vulnerable seams. In the end, no armor was perfect. It could delay death, it could deflect it, but it could never erase it. Armor did more than guard flesh, it shaped the entire medieval battlefield. It was a constant reminder that survival wasn't just about courage or skill. It was about protection, preparation, and the endless human struggle to outlast the storm of steel. If armor was a soldier's second skin, the shield was his closest companion. Few weapons of defense in history carried such profound importance, not only as a barrier of wood and iron, but as an extension of the warrior's very identity. To carry a shield was to carry one's life, painted, carved, and battered with the marks of survival. At its core, a shield was simple, wood often layered with planks or leather, bound with metal edges and fitted with a central boss of iron. Yet from this simplicity came an incredible variety of forms. Round shields, light and versatile, allowed for swift maneuvering. Kite shields, long and tapering, protected not only the torso but the leg, perfect for cavalry. Later came the heater shields, compact and triangular, favored in the tournaments of knights, but deadly practical in war. Each design reflected the shifting demands of battle, shaped as much by culture as by necessity. The shield was not a passive wall, it was a weapon in itself. Soldiers used them to shove, to bash, to blindside opponents. In the crush of a shield wall, they were as dangerous as any blade. Rows of men locked together behind their shields became an unbreakable machine, advancing step by step, iron tips thrusting from within the wooden barrier. To face it was to face not individuals, but a single relentless organism of war. But the shield also carried meaning beyond combat. Painted with symbols, coats of arms, or crude designs, it was a statement of who a soldier was, where he came from, and whom he fought for. For knights, shields became canvases of heraldry, declaring lineage and allegiance. For peasants, they might bear nothing more than rough colors or marks, yet still they transformed plain wood into banners of defiance. In war, the shield was both armor and story. Perhaps its greatest gift, however, was psychological. To hold a shield was to hold courage. With it, men stood firm, believing themselves safe against storms of arrows or the crashing charge of cavalry. Without it, even the strongest fighter felt exposed, naked against the chaos of battle. Shields absorbed fear as much as steel, taking blows that would have otherwise shattered flesh and bone. Over time, as armor grew heavier and weapons more sophisticated, shields began to shrink, then fade. By the late Middle Ages, fully armored knights often carried only small bucklers, discs of steel for deflecting blades in duels. Yet for centuries, the shield had been the faithful partner of every soldier, from the humblest levy to the mightiest lord. On the battlefield, where swords flashed and axes fell, it was often the shield that decided who lived long enough to strike back. A slab of wood, an iron boss, and the will to hold the line, that was sometimes all that stood between a man and death. Every medieval soldier, no matter how poor or how mighty, carried one weapon in common, a dagger. It was the quiet tool of war, rarely glorified in songs, yet indispensable both in camp and in combat. By day it cut bread, mended rope, or cleaned armor. By night it was the last line of survival. In the chaos of battle, when spears splintered and swords slipped from bloodied hands, a dagger was the steel that remained. These weapons were deceptively simple, yet their forms reflected centuries of experience in piercing armor. The rondel dagger, with its stiff, needle-like blade, was designed to find the joints of mail and plate. Bollock daggers, named for their provocative hilt shape, were favored across Europe, often doubling as status symbols as much as tools of survival. The baselard, long and heavy, blurred the line between short sword and dagger, allowing soldiers to bridge the gap between melee and finishing strike. Daggers were intimate weapons. They demanded closeness, the terrifying embrace of combat where breath and sweat mingled. A soldier could thrust a rondel beneath a visor or drive it into the vulnerable armpit of an armored foe. Many deaths on medieval fields came not from elegant swordplay, but from the crude, efficient work of a dagger sliding into a gap. It was the weapon of certainty, ending what larger arms had begun. But not all fights could be solved with a blade's edge. As armor grew thicker and more cunningly forged, crushing force became the solution. Thus rose the mace, blunt, brutal, and terrifying. A simple wooden shaft with a heavy iron or bronze head, the mace ignored finesse. Its task was to shatter. Against chainmail or even plate, a well-placed swing could break bones, concuss through helmets, or leave a knight reeling on the ground. The flail, with its chain-linked spiked head, took unpredictability to new extremes. Where shields could deflect a sword, a flail's head whipped around defenses, striking from unexpected angles. Yet it was a dangerous partner hard to control, as likely to harm its wielder as its enemy. Only the practiced dared trust it, but in skilled hands, it became chaos incarnate. The warhammer, meanwhile, was the craftsman's compromise between precision and devastation. One side bore a blunt hammer, capable of staggering strikes. The other often ended in a spike, designed to puncture through armor. Few weapons captured the ingenuity of medieval combat so well, a tool that could crush, pierce, and hook in a single motion. Soldiers used the hammer's beak to snag reins, pull down opponents, or puncture breastplates. These weapons, daggers, maces, flails, hammers, were not glamorous. They lacked the romance of the knightly sword. Yet they told the real story of medieval battle. When swords clashed and shields shattered, it was often the blunt, the simple, and the brutal that ended lives. A dagger in the ribs, a mace to the skull, a hammer's spike slipping beneath the visor. Such was the unspoken reality of war. Not the shining duels sung by bards, but the cold, efficient work of steel designed for the close and final act. Not every battle was decided at sword's reach. Some were won or lost long before steel clashed, in the silence of a drawn bowstring and the hiss of arrows through the air. Distance was its own kind of power, and archery gave armies the ability to kill without ever standing face to face with their enemy. The longbow was the terror of medieval Europe. Tall as a man, often hewn from English yew, it required immense strength to draw over 100 pounds of force in many cases. To master it was not a skill learned in months, but a lifetime of training. Bones reshaped from childhood practice, arms permanently twisted by constant strain. Yet in return, the longbow offered devastation. At battles like Agincourt, volleys of thousands of arrows turned charging knights into forests of fallen steel. Their plate pierced, their horses brought crashing down in heaps. Unlike swords or spears, the longbow was democratic in its destruction. A peasant archer could kill a noble knight from 200 yards away. Skill, not wealth, decided the outcome, and this terrified the nobility of Europe. Laws were even, passed in England demanding regular archery practice, ensuring that villages produced not just farmers, but hidden armies of lethal marksmen. But the longbow had its weaknesses. It demanded training, strength, and favorable weather. Rain could slacken bowstrings, dampen arrows, and reduce effectiveness. And so the crossbow rose as its rival, shorter, easier to use, and terrifying. In its power, unlike the longbow, which required years of muscle memory, a crossbow could be wielded effectively after mere weeks of instruction. A crank or lever did the work of drawing its string, allowing even a lightly trained soldier to send a bolt slicing through mail or plate. To face a crossbowman was to face inevitability. Its quarrels carried staggering force, often punching clean through armor at close range. So feared were crossbows that the Catholic Church, in 1139, declared them unfit for Christians to use. Against Christians, a weapon too cruel, too decisive. Yet war has little regard for bans, and armies across Europe embraced the crossbow for centuries. Still, both bow and crossbow had their own tyranny. They shaped not just battles, but strategy. Archers and crossbowmen forced enemies to reconsider formations, to advance with shields raised, to scatter under storms of missiles. They broke cavalry. Charges disrupted shield walls, and dictated the tempo of war before swords could ever cross. Beyond war, they carried cultural echoes. The longbow became a symbol of English might, tied to legends of Robin Hood and the yeoman archer. The crossbow became infamous in Italy, Germany, and France, a weapon of mercenaries and city militias, feared by all who faced them. In the end, the bow and crossbow changed the battlefield more than any sword or axe ever could. They reminded every warrior that no matter how strong his arm or fine his armor, death could arrive unseen, loosed from 100 yards away by a man he would never meet. On the medieval battlefield, distance was not safety. It was simply another kind of danger, silent until the moment the arrow struck. Battles between men were fierce, but wars were often decided not in open fields, but at the stone walls of castles and fortified cities. To conquer these fortresses required more than courage and steel. It demanded the giants of medieval warfare. Siege weapons. These towering machines transformed war into an art of engineering, where wood, rope, and iron became as deadly as any sword. The simplest of these was the battering ram, a massive log, often capped with iron, suspended by chains, or mounted on wheels. Driven by teams of soldiers, it pounded gates and walls with relentless force, each swing echoing like thunder. In time, castle gates that seemed impregnable splintered under the repeated blows, not because of elegance, but because of persistence and brute strength. But when walls grew thicker, more cunning devices emerged. The catapult, whether the mangonel or the onager, hurled stones, burning tar, and even diseased corpses into besieged towns. They turned gravity and tension into destruction, sowing terror as much as damage. To hear the crash of a boulder slamming into stone was to feel inevitability, creeping closer with every strike. Yet the true kings of the siege were the trebuchet's massive counterweight, engines that could hurl projectiles weighing hundreds of pounds over astonishing distances. These machines were engineering marvels, capable of shattering walls, smashing towers, or raining death upon defenders hiding behind stone. Entire forests could be stripped to construct just one, and when it loomed on the horizon, it was as much a psychological weapon as a physical one. The enemy knew nothing they built could last forever. Defenders were not passive. They poured boiling oil, dropped stones, and loosed arrows from battlements. They built murder holes in their gates, through which missiles rained down upon attackers. Countermines were dug to intercept tunneling enemies who sought to collapse walls from beneath. Every attack birthed a counter, every weapon an answer. One of the most ingenious and terrifying siege tools was Greek fire, a weapon of flame said to burn even upon water. Though its secrets belonged largely to the Byzantine Empire, legends of its use spread fear throughout Europe. In later centuries, crude versions of fire weapons, pitch-soaked barrels, flaming arrows continued its legacy, turning the night skies of sieges into infernos. And yet, for all their grandeur, siege weapons were slow, costly, and grueling. Building them required immense resources. Operating them demanded coordination and bravery under fire. Weeks could turn to months as besiegers starved defenders, cutting supply lines, waiting hunger to do what no weapon could. Still, siege engines redefined medieval war. They shifted the balance from knightly valor to engineering mastery. A lone warrior might win glory in battle, but it was the massive shadow of the trebuchet, the endless pounding of the ram, and the roar of fire over walls that truly broke kingdoms. Swords decided duels, siege weapons decided dynasties. As the Middle Ages drew toward their end, a new sound began to echo across the battlefields of Europe, not the clash of steel or the twang of bowstrings, but the thunder of gunpowder. What began as an experiment with Chinese fire powder slowly reshaped the entire face of war. The age of the sword and shield was giving way to the age of smoke, fire, and iron shot. The earliest weapons were crude, hand cannons, little more than metal tubes mounted on wooden poles. They were dangerous not only to the enemy, but to those who fired them, prone to bursting from the sheer force of their own explosions. Yet even these primitive devices terrified opponents. The roar, the flash, the choking smoke, it was as much psychological warfare as physical. Men unused to the sound of thunder on earth often broke and fled before the weapon had even found its mark. Soon, the arquebus appeared, a more refined firearm with a trigger mechanism and a longer barrel. Though slow to load and wildly inaccurate by modern standards, it carried one devastating truth: it could pierce armor. The finest steel plate, once thought invincible, could be punctured by a lead ball fired from 50 yards. Centuries of craftsmanship in armor making were suddenly undone by the alchemy of powder and shot. This revolution spelled doom for the knight. For centuries, heavily armored cavalry had ruled the battlefield, their charge feared and often unstoppable. But against rows of arquebusiers, supported by pikemen who kept horsemen at bay, the knight's supremacy faltered. Valor and lineage mattered less when a peasant with a firearm could kill a lord with a single pull of the trigger. The rise of cannons was even more transformative. Massive bombards reduced castle walls, once thought eternal, to rubble within days. The great sieges of the late Middle Ages were decided not by starvation or towering trebuchets, but by the relentless pounding of iron balls hurled from gunpowder engines. Stone fortresses, the pride of medieval lords, became obsolete. New styles of fortification, angled bastions, low thick walls emerged, marking the birth of early modern warfare. Gunpowder was more than a weapon, it was a social equalizer. It gave power to those who lacked noble birth, allowing common soldiers to strike down armored elites. It shifted warfare from duels of champions to the grim efficiency of mass volleys and disciplined ranks. The clash of individuals was replaced by the coordinated fire of formations, smoke and thunder replacing the glitter of steel dot, yet the transition was not immediate. Swords, bows, and armor lingered for centuries, sharing the battlefield with gunpowder. But the tide was unstoppable. Where once battles were songs of shining knights and ringing steel, now they became thunderous storms of smoke, flame, and lead. The medieval world was fading. A new age, louder, deadlier, and more impersonal, had begun. If weapons were the fangs of medieval war, then shields and armor were the skin, the first and last line of survival when steel came crashing down. Without them, even the bravest knight or humblest footman would stand naked before a storm of arrows and blades. With them, men could defy death a moment longer, buying time to strike back. The shield was the most ancient defender, and it never left the battlefield. In the early Middle Ages, the kite shield dominated, long and curved, protecting a rider's leg as well as his torso. It was the signature of Norman knights, carried at Hastings in 1066, painted with bold colors and heraldic beasts that turned armies into moving banners. Later came the heater shield, shorter, triangular, and better suited for knights encased in mail or plate, giving protection without excess weight. Infantry, meanwhile, relied on Pavis's towering shields planted in the earth, behind which archers and crossbowmen could reload under cover from storms of arrows. But shields were only half the story. The true revolution of medieval defense lay in armor. At first, it was the humble gambus in a quilted jacket of layered cloth, deceptively simple, yet able to turn aside cuts and soften the blow of arrows. Over it came mail, the shimmering net of interlocked iron rings. Mail was flexible, draping across the body like fabric, yet it could stop slashes and slow thrusts. For centuries it was the armor of choice, worn by kings and common soldiers alike. And then, the age of plate arrived. At first, it appeared in fragments: iron greaves for the legs, a breastplate for the chest, gauntlets for the hands. But by the 14th and 15th centuries, the full suit of plate had emerged, gleaming steel from head to toe, crafted by master armorers who shaped metal like tailors shaped cloth. The knight became a walking fortress, capable of withstanding arrows, sword strikes, even blows from axes and maces. A well-forged harness could weigh 40 to 60 pounds, but balanced so perfectly that a trained knight could mount, fight, and even run with astonishing freedom. Armor was more than protection, it was identity. A knight's armor was tailored to him, as unique as his fingerprint. Etched with engravings, gilded with gold, sometimes even inlaid with jewels. Armor declared wealth, status, and lineage. In jousts, it became spectacle. In battle, it was survival, yet armor was not invincible. The rise of crossbows, longbows, and finally gunpowder slowly eroded its supremacy. By the 16th century, many breastplates were proofed, tested with a pistol shot, the dent left visible as reassurance of quality. But as firearms grew deadlier, even the finest steel could no longer guarantee safety. Armor became heavier, then thinner, until eventually it disappeared from the battlefield altogether. Still, in its golden age, armor transformed men into legends. It was not just metal. It was hope, a second skin against death, and the silent companion of every sword and spear. To strike against a man in full plate was to strike against the very progress of human craft, against centuries of ingenuity hammered into every curve of steel. On the battlefield, weapons spoke of destruction, but shields and armor whispered of survival. And in that delicate balance between blade and barrier, death and defense, the story of medieval war was truly written. If siege weapons were the giants of destruction, then castles were the mountains built to withstand them. They were not just homes for lords, but symbols of dominance, control, and defiant stone guardians that stood watch over lands, rivers, and roads. To build a castle was to plant a fist into the earth and declare, "This is mine, and none shall take it." Early fortifications began as motte and bailey designs, wooden towers perched on earthen mounds, surrounded by palisades and ditches. Simple, quick to build, and effective, these were the first footholds of Norman power across Europe. But wood burned and timber rotted. Soon, lords demanded stone. The stone keep rose next, massive square towers with thick walls, narrow windows, and a single entrance high above the ground. From these keeps, defenders could rain arrows, boiling water, or stones upon any who dared approach. Yet stone keeps, for all their strength, had blind spots, and besiegers grew wiser. By the High Middle Ages, castles became far more sophisticated. Concentric castles like those built during the Crusades boasted layers of defense, an outer wall, an inner wall, and towers bristling with archers. Even if attackers breached one layer, they would be funneled into killing zones, trapped under a hail of arrows and rocks. Every turn, every gate, every wall was designed to slow, exhaust, and bleed an invading army. The moat added another line of defense, sometimes dry, often filled with water, forcing attackers to slow their charge, or build cumbersome bridges under fire. Drawbridges and portcullises turned castle gates into death traps, where enemies could be crushed, shot, or set aflame. Murder holes, carved into ceilings above gateways, allowed defenders to pour boiling oil, pitch, or sand upon intruders. But defense was not just about walls, it was about endurance. Castles were stocked with food, water, and supplies to outlast sieges that could drag on for months. Secret wells ensured water even when outside sources were cut. Underground tunnels provided hidden escape routes or sudden surprise attacks upon unsuspecting besiegers. For those trapped inside, morale was as crucial as stone. The sight of banners flying from towers told both friend and foe that the castle still stood, that its defenders had not broken. For besiegers, every day that passed without victory drained their strength, their food, their will. Sometimes castles won wars not by defeating enemies in combat, but by simply refusing to fall. And yet, no fortress was eternal. Siege engines grew stronger, cannons thundered louder, and walls once thought unbreakable crumbled. But in the heart of the Middle Ages, the castle was more than a military stronghold. It was the very embodiment of power, a place where lords ruled, armies gathered, and enemies hesitated before daring to strike. For centuries, as swords clashed and trebuchets thundered, castles stood as the unyielding backbone of medieval defense. And when night fell and the fires of war died down, Their towering silhouettes remained on the horizon silent, enduring reminders that survival was not only about the weapons one wielded, but the walls one built to endure.